That's right. That's with a 5, not a 6. It is Election Day. And Andrew, while we don't have any big statewide races or anything else, let alone national, we do, however, have some interesting races throughout the region. Which ones caught your eye?
Well, certainly interesting races. I want to start in Rockland County, so Scott's home turf here, so he can weigh in. The race for sheriff has been just nasty and contentious all the way through. Richard Vasquez, who's the chief of police in Woodbury, the issues about his suspension from the job for campaigning too much, reports that he's had domestic violence calls to his house. He claims that the incumbent, Louis Falco, has mismanaged the jail and the correction system. Falco says that he's the fiscally responsible choice, and I'm curious, Scott, what your take is on this race and also the internal politics that you know so well in Rockland County.
And the curious timing of removing him from,
Yeah, I mean, one has to wonder what that was about, but I mean, there are other issues, as Andrew have mentioned. A lot of this has to do with a dispute between the county executive, currently Ed Day, and Falco. Mm-hmm. Falco, however, is an incumbent who enjoys, I think, a lot of support from both Republicans and Democrats. He's a likable guy. Corrections officers aren't happy with him but corrections officers aren't happy with any executive. I mean, that's just, it has to be that way. There's no other way to describe it. Yeah. So I think Lou Falco will probably be victorious, particularly with, but there's in Rockland County with other races, as you are well aware, Andrew, there's a certain toxicity which exists, and a lot of it relates to the community, Hasidic community, and issues there, and it's just been a tough race.
From a broad level, if there's school board elections, does it drive turnout much more than if there aren't? When there's an off-year election?
What do you mean, school board?
Well, in certain communities throughout the region, tonight is not just election night, but it's also for school boards. And I'm curious, is that a variable where if there's school board elections, a lot more people are going to vote than not?
Not in Rockland, no. Because those occur usually in May, so
Gotcha.
it doesn't do it there.
All right, the race that I think might have the potential to be the tightest tonight is in Nassau County, and it's the race for district attorney. Two very well qualified candidates, albeit qualified for different reasons. Acting DA Madeline Singas, who replaced Kathleen Rice when she was elected to Congress, is a 24-year prosecutor. She's been on the job. She's up against Kate Murray, who's well known as the Hempstead supervisor, but she's more of a management experience as opposed to a practicing attorney. She hasn't practiced in 17 years. Murray, you have to think, has the name recognition and the party organization advantage in Nassau County, whereas Singas has gotten all the endorsements, whether it's the New York Times or even the local paper on Long Island. Latest poll in this race has it dead even. And Jeannie, I'm wondering if I know you've been paying attention to this race as well. This one really could go right down to the wire, especially on a low turnout election.
It absolutely could, and I think what's been so fascinating is you talk to voters out there, and you've got Republicans who say they want to cross party lines because they're worried about issues of corruption out there, and they want to make sure you have an quote unquote outsider voice, and as you mentioned, someone with the experience in the job. So I'm very curious because obviously the Republican has the advantage party-wise out there, so it is going to depend on turnout. But I do think that this, the incumbent, if you can call her that, at this point, at least what I'm hearing in terms of endorsements and people on the ground, she does seem to have an awful lot of support.
Yeah, every major daily
every major paper.
But Tom, can you remember a DA? I mean, Nassau's a big county, okay? A DA that hasn't been inside a courtroom in 20 years? That hasn't prosecuted a case?
Well, most of them, the elected officials, or at least the district attorneys in New York, because those are the bigger ones, they, for the most part, don't prosecute cases. They hand them off to their.
But to get elected, when you first get in, you had to have been inside a courtroom.
Oh, you mean a track record leading up to?
Get into the
Of
game.
course. I mean, other than that, it's party politics, and that's going to work against you. There's normally a track record.
Yes.
The other subtle issue in this race may be future plans or political aspirations. Kate Murray was well known as a Hempstead supervisor. I think most people would anticipate she would try to use this.
For folks who don't know, Long Island's a major job.
Yeah. Right, it's the biggest town in Nassau County. I think most people would anticipate if she wins DA, she might have eyes on a different rung of the electoral ladder at some point down the road, whereas Singas might be more inclined to stay put. I don't know if that's a factor for people as they vote.
And to that point, I think it speaks to her potentially being beholden to the party more so than Singas, and so I think that's going to be an issue.
Now, in New Jersey, there are a lot of mayoral races and local races, but we're keeping an eye particularly on the state assembly. All 80 seats of the lower house in Trenton are on the ballot today. Now, most of these districts already lean sharply to one party or the other thanks to gerrymandering. Competitive races tend to hinge on specifically local issues, back and forth allegations, that as well. But you got to think that a Democratic win tonight, again, they have 47 seats in the Assembly right now. If they increase that, you're going to think that's going to be a rebuke of Governor Christie, because and I'm curious, what do you think voters on a race on an Assembly level are thinking? Are they thinking of the two individual candidates? Are they thinking bigger party affiliation, the governor?
Yeah, that's a good question, because it usually comes down to who's actually running. But in this case, Christie's made so many enemies, and he's so out there that there may be a backlash there. I would turn to the professor, but I would think there's you may have a combination of those things. You know, the local guy is the guy you really look for, but I'm not voting for a Republican to give Christie any more power, is an attitude.
Now, there's almost no chance that Republicans are going to take control of the Assembly, but I'm curious, where do voters' motivations lie in a race, like an Assembly race?
I mean, usually you have an incumbent who is favored, and so that's a standard issue. But, you have the New York Times coming out the other day saying that Chris Christie should get out of the race and go home and do his job. So I do think there can be a Christie factor. And frankly, whether there is or not, it's going to be interpreted as such. And so that's a big problem for Chris Christie
And I know
going
from Jersey Republicans, up and down the food chain, but certainly in the state legislature, there was this barely veiled feeling that Christie, no matter what, never went and campaigned, never raised money, never was the party father for Republicans that he looked out for number one. Now, even if he offered, they don't want it right now because of the baggage that's going along. And those are Jersey polling numbers just for the state of New Jersey. Forget about the presidential. So I don't know.
I want to get into one more race in the area, and this one we thought was going to be over in the primary, but it's bleeding into the general election. That's the mayor's race in Mount Vernon. Richard Thomas is expected to win. It's a three-way battle among Democrats. All three of these candidates are Democrats, even though they're on different party lines. But you keep hearing, and Richard Thomas has Republican, the Democratic line, and the Independence line. But I keep hearing about Ruth Hassel Thompson. She's well known as a state senator. Albany types continue to talk about her. She's running on the Working Families Party line, which is to the left of the Democratic line. Dominic, this feels like this is all about consolidating the Democratic vote. Is your sense, and I know you moderated one of the primary debates, do you get the sense that there's enough movement out there that Ruth Hassel Thompson might be able to score what would probably be an enormous upset?
Absolutely not. Wishful thinking on her part. Richard Thomas is the next mayor of Mount Vernon. I sat down and talked to the losing incumbent mayor off the record about a week ago. And when I asked him the same scenario that you've been talking about, he almost broke out in laughter and said, no, Richard Thomas is the next mayor. And he said he even brought him to City Hall to get him ready to be the mayor of Mount Vernon.
There are about 4 or 5 races across the region tonight where you have what was a primary contest that has now spilled out into the general election, much like we saw in Mount Vernon. And Scott, I'm wondering how, when you have a party that's fractured like that, how do you bring it back together? Or in some cases, prevent somebody from the other party from winning? If you've got 2 Republicans running on 2 different lines and a Democrat who's in there, how do you stop the Democrat from winning?
Precisely. It breaks it all up. And these things aren't usually settled at the electoral, the election. They're settled sometime after, when all the partners finish yelling at each other. Then they start to talk about how they're going to try to cooperate.
Short memories and some practical.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. But there are so many people who just vote party line that third candidate isn't going to have a shot in most cases, except to hurt the party that he broke from. So, it's hard to say, but I do know, for example, in Rockland, there's a couple of those, and it'll be interesting to see where they come out.
And Rich, I'll just tell you that we're going to have updates all night long on FiOS 1 News for whatever region you're watching FiOS 1 on.
You will be a very busy man, Andrew Whitman. All right, we come back. Somebody that's not up for election, but might have a tough re-election coming up if the numbers hold on. Talking about this guy, Mayor de Blasio, his poll numbers, they keep on falling. Even the New York Times is piling on the progressive mayor. Now, I'm going to explain why, or try to, and we're going to ask the table, why is he so unpopular? And what, if anything, can he do to turn things around?